Welcome to this online lesson on the introduction of gunpowder weapons to European warfare, the Gunpowder Revolution, how were guns introduced to late medieval warfare. The aims of this lesson are to know key vocabulary about early guns, to explain why armies moved from bows to gunpowder, and to evaluate the impact of firearms on military tactics. Your do now tasks are as follows. An early arquebus gun could fire roughly 1 shot per minute. Such a gun is shown in the picture of the gentleman holding the gun over his shoulder just to the left of this instruction. A longbowman, as also pictured, could shoot around 15 to 20 arrows in the same time. What might make the gun a better weapon? Give 1 to 3 specific advantages of the gun over the longbow. Pause the video now while you attempt that. Done? Well, what did we think of? Well, for one thing, the longbow, as we've looked at before, was an incredibly difficult weapon to use well. One needed to have immense upper body strength to even draw a longbow. This required years and years of training. Sometimes soldiers raised for armies in battle were not given this amount of training. In fact, the longbow only survived as an English weapon for so long because there was such a culture of training with the longbow. The gun, on the other hand, was far easier to use, far easier to train with, and also, at short range at least, more powerful. But don't kid yourself that it was a necessarily better weapon than the longbow. It didn't necessarily have a better range, it didn't necessarily have better accuracy, and in fact it certainly didn't have as good accuracy. But there's one other less obvious advantage to it as well, and that is the ammunition. Each arrow fired by a longbow was a precision engineered bit of kit. It had an iron tip to it, it had goose feathered fletchings on the back, and it needed to be just the right width. If it was not tapered in the right way, it would simply snap whilst being fired, or loosed I should say. If it was too thick a shaft to the arrow, then it wouldn't fly far enough. So it was a very skilled job just to make the ammunition. On the other hand, a lead ball, as used in the arquebus, could be cast very simply by the soldier himself. So plenty of perhaps not necessarily obvious advantages of the gun over the longbow. Firstly, an introduction to gunpowder itself. What is gunpowder? Gunpowder was invented by the Chinese about 1400 years ago, but it was introduced to Europe in the 1200s, although it took a good few hundred years for it to become common in battles. It was made from 4 parts of potassium nitrate, this is sometimes called saltpeter, 3 parts of charcoal, and 3 parts of sulphur. Now these materials were mostly pretty easy to get hold of. Charcoal could be made from just burnt down wood, and potassium nitrate could actually be taken from dried up urine, and sulphur was also widely available as a mineral. So, as long as it was mixed in the correct proportions, it has an interesting reaction. When introduced to heat or lit, gunpowder burns furiously. But don't kid yourself that it's a high explosive. It is not a high explosive, it's actually quite a low explosive. But the amount of gas and heat produced by burning gunpowder can be produced very quickly, and if you can find that within a tight space, such as a gun barrel, it will push a projectile out with sudden and great force, and a loud bang. But at the same time, it is not so powerful that early guns would necessarily be blown apart by the force. Some brief tasks then. Record the ingredients of gunpowder. Secondly, explain where and when it was developed. And thirdly, explain how gunpowder is used in weapons. Pause the video, and then when you're done, press play to continue. Done? Alright, well remember, gunpowder burns very furiously and very quickly. By containing that, you can cause a small explosion which can push a projectile out of a gun. And that's the idea of all guns, even to this day. Although they rarely use black gunpowder like they used to back in the Middle Ages. Let's have a look at the anatomy of the gun. This part of the lesson is going to include some etymology as well. Early guns may not look much like modern ones, but their basic parts have similar or the same names as modern guns. Your task is on your own copy of the pictures of the guns, label the main components. If you don't have your own copy of these pictures, what you could do is take a screenshot of this video and possibly print that, or maybe make some basic drawings of your own. It's up to you. Also, as a tip, some of the terms apply to both the cannon and the arquebus, which is an early type of handgun. Firstly, the barrel. This is the tube from which projectiles are fired. Then the muzzle, the mouth of the barrel, also where early guns were loaded. Then we have the breech. This is the gap at the back end of the gun where the gunpowder is lit. Then the trigger, the lever to fire the gun. The lock, this is the trigger mechanism. The stock, the wooden handle to brace against the shoulder and prevent the gun flying away. And the carriage, this is the cradle holding the gun, which sometimes, but not always, had wheels. See if you can label those parts of the gun now. As an extension, what might be the origin of some of these words? Think about the world in which they were invented. What might they be named after? Pause the video now, have a go at completing the task, and then we'll move on and have a look at some answers. How did you get on? Well, let's have a look at the answers. The barrel, the tube from which projectiles are fired, is on both of these weapons. Notice that it is much larger on the cannon and therefore it fired a much larger projectile. Then we have the muzzle. This is also on both guns. This is the mouth of the barrel, also where the early guns were loaded. So if you've ever seen footage of people shoving musket balls or bullets down the end of a gun, that is known as a muzzle loading weapon. Then we have the breech. This is the gap at the back of the gun where the gunpowder is lit. You can see the gunner with his linstock about to light the cannon there. Then we have the trigger. This is only found on the arquebus. There is an argument that the gun is actually one of the world's first lever or button operated devices. Then we have the lock, also only on the arquebus. This was usually a spring-loaded or simply lever operated device which would introduce a spark or a small flame or smouldering match to the gunpowder. Then we have the stock, also found only on the arquebus, and on modern guns for that matter. And then we have the carriage. This is found only on the cannon. Later guns would have wheels so that they could be wheeled around the battlefield and transported between battles more easily. Perhaps you considered some of the etymology or origins behind some of these words. Well, let's start with barrel. Early guns were actually created a lot like wooden barrels, with strips of metal tightly held together with bands of metal to strengthen them. You can notice these bands of metal going around the barrel of the gun in the early cannon. That is where the word gun barrel gets its name. Also the muzzle. Well, where is the muzzle on an animal? It's its mouth. So the gaping mouth of the weapon is much like the gaping mouth of an animal. And if you've ever got on the wrong side of a dog muzzle, you'll know that it hurts. And the breech. Well, think about the similar sounding word breach, meaning a gap in something. This is one possible origin of the word breech here as well. To trigger something? Well, this comes from a Dutch word, which means to set something off. And so you can see the meaning with the guns here as well. The lock? Well, locks had existed for centuries before the guns had, and the mechanism worked in a very similar way to an early door lock and was often made by the same craftsman, hence the name. Finally, the stock. Well, remember the wooden stocks. Anything that was a stock could be held against the shoulder. And then the carriage, well, it carries the gun. So, when we consider that you have the whole gun together, you have the lot: lock, stock, and barrel. You would need 3 different craftsmen to produce an early gun. Onwards. Let's consider the adoption of the gun to late medieval warfare. The English were late to adopt guns. Why might this have been the case? Any ideas? Well, the English relied on the longbow. It worked, so why not use it? And the English preserved a culture of using the longbow and training how to use it. And so we had a more ready supply of soldiers who were trained in the use of the longbow than many other European nations. Guns could be both difficult and dangerous to use. They had to be used for the right things too. Let's consider the uses of cannon. Early cannon were great at blasting down walls in sieges. Bye-bye castles. They were very difficult and slow to load, and even more difficult to transport on medieval roads. They could sometimes even explode, killing the gunners, so they were quite dangerous to use as well as to face. But ultimately, artillery or cannon of these types pretty much spelt the end of the age of the castle right away. Castles had to be very much redesigned in order to cope with this threat, and ultimately no castle was safe from heavy artillery. Handguns, arquebuses, and muskets. These are all names for early handheld guns. They were all portable, and they were faster to load, about 1 to 2 shots per minute. Early guns like this could be dangerous to use, but they were 20 times more powerful than a bow. They were very inaccurate though. However, if you were faced with a line of soldiers charging at you, the chances are that your bullet would hit one of them. The power of these bullets was such that even plate armour of the late Middle Ages was no match for the power of the bullet. And so this is the start of the decline in the use of armour with soldiers. Note that most soldiers in the late Middle Ages, in the Tudor periods and the English Civil War wore very little, if any, armour. This was because it was impractical. When facing guns, you were better off being able to run away or to advance more quickly than to be loaded down with useless armour that couldn't stop bullets. Your tasks then. Firstly, describe 2 advantages of cannon and handheld guns. This is 2 advantages of those guns over earlier weapons, I should add. Then describe 2 disadvantages of cannon and handheld guns, again compared to earlier weapons. Thirdly, as an extension, what would be easier to train how to use, bows or muskets? Consider how these are used and how difficult it is. Lastly, explain at least one possible effect the introduction of handheld guns might have on battle tactics. As a tip, what effect might guns have on cavalry and foot soldiers? Remember that early guns were very slow to load. Would this make cavalry more or less effective? Give it some thought. Pause the video now. Finished? Well, let's consider some answers. Advantages of the cannon and the handheld guns over earlier weapons largely relate to their power. Cannon are far more effective and more powerful than early trebuchets and catapults for downing walls. Also, the handgun and the arquebus and musket are so much more effective at defeating armour than even the longbow, despite its power. What about the disadvantages? Well, you might have mentioned factors that relate to the safety of their operation and also the speed with which they could be loaded and used. But remember, the gun was far easier to train how to use than it was a longbow. You could learn how to fire a musket in a matter of a day or so, perhaps not particularly safely, but you could, rather than the bow, which would take a lifetime of strengthening and conditioning and practice to use. What about the effect of the introduction of these handheld weapons on the battlefield? Well, because they were so slow to load, cavalry could charge down musketeers and arquebusiers quite easily compared to longbowmen. However, if you had a slowly advancing enemy, particularly those infantry who were heavily armoured, then you had a great advantage because shields and plate armour were useless against the bullets. Let's move on. We're going to consider some sources now, and in particular how guns were used in early sieges. Source skills are very important in history. Getting information from them is a skill that you will be assessed on in any exam. First task is to read source A. It's in the pink box at the top there. Source A description of the English siege of Barrack. They made many assaults with guns. They destroyed many a fair house, and churches were also beaten to the earth with great stones that pitilessly came out of the guns. But the enemy abided there for so long, that means they put up with it, so that they only gave up when the food ran out. Firstly, let's comprehend what this says. What damage is being caused by the guns? Pause the video now and record some of your findings. What did you come up with? Well, you may have noticed that they've beaten down the houses with cannonballs and churches too, and that they're firing stones. This might sound strange, but early cannon often used carefully chiselled stone balls rather than iron ones. Iron was a very precious material that was very difficult to get hold of and very valuable to be firing at your enemies. Okay, let's have a look at the next bit. Now we're going to infer. This means we're going to be getting some information which is not quite so obvious. What might have been the reaction of the people of the town to the destruction? And B, what words are clues to this reaction? Pause the video now and have a go. Well, look at words like pitilessly. It's the idea that the guns themselves have got this sort of violent or horrible personality. This is a writing technique that English linguists call pathetic fallacy. It's where you give certain inanimate objects human characteristics. The idea that a gun could be pitiless. How about the enemy abided there for so long? Well, this actually suggests that although they might have been terrified by the guns, they actually put up with it. What evidence is there that the guns were not effective siege weapons? Pause the video now. Well, note that it says at the end of the source they only gave up when the food ran out. Much as people might have been terrified by the destruction and the noise of the guns, it wasn't what actually decided this battle. The lack of food did. And that was quite a common outcome within sieges. Lastly, study the picture. How can you tell that it was made at a time of transition between old weapons and cannon? Take a moment or two to have a look at the picture now and record some findings. Pause the video, then press play again when you're done. Alright, what did you find? Well, notice that the wall is being scaled by a ladder and there's a man holding a shield, and at the top of the battlements there's a man firing a crossbow and someone else hurling a rock down. Also, facing the castle, we have longbows at the back. We have a crossbow in the middle. But we also have handguns being fired in the middle and a handgun being reloaded and in the foreground, and behind an early field gun. We can see it's got the wheel on there and the barrel of another projecting behind. Transition means the change from one thing to another. In the late Middle Ages there was a transition period where guns were being used very much alongside earlier weapons like catapults and various types of bows, and that is shown in this particular image. We'll move on now. In that source it mentions the town of Barrack. Barrack was fought over by the Scots and the English for centuries. A large castle was built in Barrack and was variously controlled by the English and Scots throughout the ages. Today it's controlled by, well, nobody, because it was turned into a railway station. Yes, they didn't really care about preserving historic buildings in the Victorian age in the same way that we do now. However, in the time of Elizabeth I, when Barrack was under the control of the English, which it still is, a huge number of defence works were thrown up. I had the pleasure of walking around some of these defences a few months ago, and I was very impressed by the scale and size of them. But what became immediately apparent was how carefully designed they were. Look at the picture quite carefully and you'll notice that there is a very angular wall going around the outside of the town. These arrows indicate the fields of fire of weapons that could be placed within and along these walls. Note that there are no blind spots. If someone came up to the middle of one of the walls furthest from the bastions, these are the projecting angular shapes coming out of the sides of the walls, then they would get crossfire from either sides of those galleries. Equally, if they tried to get right up to the wall on one of the bastions to the north, then the bastions to the south could fire along the wall as well. There was absolutely no blind spot here, and these guns could cause devastation to anyone attacking these walls from any location. Let's contrast that with an earlier medieval wall. Here we see one section of Dover Castle in Kent. Firstly, we've got the medieval walls to the south of this picture. This gives the field of fire of some of the arrow slits on those towers. Note that the towers are round. This helped prevent them from getting undermined, as happened at Rochester Castle in 1215. However, there's a problem. The yellow area shows a dead zone. This dead zone is where none of the arrows can reach. Sure, things might be hurled down on top of them, but there's significant risk just peering over the top and doing that. Ultimately, if an enemy could get that close to the wall, the archers in the towers could not hit them. It's a dead zone. Conversely, notice the angular cannon bastion, which was built much later. It can fire right along the ditches and right along the sides of the walls. Cannon really revolutionised the way that castles were designed. Let's consider an early type of gun, the matchlock musket, so called because the gunpowder is set off with a smouldering match rather than with a more modern trigger mechanism. A matchlock musket is being fired in the photograph that you can see on this slide. There's an awful lot of smoke and noise involved with this. In fact, believe it or not, the person firing that musket is me. Yep, that's me, when I was about 20 years old, still at university, and I still had hair. And hope. But let's not go down that route, it's all a bit depressing. The point is, though, I was taught how to load and fire that gun in only about 20 minutes. I had a bit of practice without the gunpowder, and then eventually, under close supervision, I had to go at loading it with the gunpowder. Although, quite obviously, I wasn't allowed to put an actual bullet down the end, just a bit of rolled up newspaper. It did the job, though. Your task then, In the description to this video, I've linked a video which shows the loading procedure of a matchlock musket. Watch this as many times as you need in order to get an understanding for how it works. It's quite an intricate process, but with repetition you could learn it quite easily. Watch the video again and read your notes. Cover your notes and try to record the procedure again. How much did you remember? And finally, how difficult would it be to learn how to fire a musket? Explain your opinion. Now you'll want to spend some time reviewing your notes, and of course making your notes, and seeing the video as many times as you feel would be helpful. So pause this video now and revisit it when you're ready to move on. How did you get on? Well, let's have a look at the loading procedure and see how many of the key terms you identified and how many of the stages you were able to see. Now, the loading of the matchlock musket, certainly the way I was taught it, is as follows. Firstly, you open the pram and prime it with powder. Then you close it again so the gunpowder doesn't blow away. You then tip a charge of gunpowder into the muzzle and place a ball in and a piece of fabric wadding in to stop it falling out. You place the ball into the muzzle and ram it down the barrel with the scouring stick. Replace the scouring stick. This is sometimes called a ramrod. Blow on the match and fit it to the serpent on the lock. You blow on it to create a hot ember so that you know it will set off the gunpowder. You then test the match against the pan cover, making sure that the glowing ember of the match is going to hit where the gunpowder is. You then present or aim the gun. Sometimes a stand was used to help steady the gun. You then open the pan, pull the trigger, and bang! And hopefully your enemy falls over. So that loading operation again. Open the pan, prime it, close it again. Gunpowder down the barrel, place in the wadding. Place in the ball. Scour it home with the stick. Replace the scouring stick. Blow on the match. Fit it to the serpent. Test the match. Present the gun. Open the pan and fire. A well-trained soldier can do this operation in around 20 seconds. Although one wonders what the effect of panic might have on the reliability of it. We'll move on now. Here's how you might apply this knowledge to the exam. This is going to be a simple 4-mark question and it will not take you long to do. Describe 2 features of early gunpowder weapons. You should know what to do by now, so give it a try. You'll only want to spend about 5 or 6 minutes on this. If you're unfamiliar with how to answer this type of question, in a few moments you'll see the example and that'll give you a few pointers. Pause the video now. Ready? It's not too difficult, is it? Describe 2 features of early gunpowder weapons. 4 marks. You should award 1 mark per valid example and award another mark per valid explanation or extra specific piece of detail. Have a go at marking your work now. How many did you get? Well, compare it to this example answer if you're unsure. One feature of early gunpowder weapons was that they were very slow to load. Most, like the arquebus, were loaded down the muzzle with gunpowder, which took a long time. Another feature is that early cannon could not be transported easily. They were very heavy and roads were very bad, so they were mostly used in sieges rather than in battles. Notice that for each I've given an example about a type of gun, and I've given a bit more detail about either their advantages or their disadvantages, really focusing on the disadvantages in this case, but you wouldn't have to do that. So that's how you answer that question. Really not too taxing. The 4-mark answers you should only spend about 5 minutes to do, and you may need even less than that. Give yourself the most time you can on the big meaty answers like the 12 and 16-mark answers. Finally then, have a look at this beast of a cannon. Although the French used 9 cannon at Agincourt, although it should be said ineffectively, medieval cannon were mostly used against towns in sieges. This cannon is Mons Meg. These days it's displayed at Edinburgh Castle. It was used by the Scots against the English in wars in the mid-1400s. It could fire a stone ball, like the one on the left, 2 miles. However, it could barely be transported. It would take a whole team of horses, and only very dry roads would allow Mons Meg to trundle past without getting stuck in the mud. So let's do a bit of a summary. Why were early cannon unsuitable for use in most battles? Record your answer. And then secondly, what changes would need to be made to cannon to make them field artillery? these were guns that could be used in battles. Pause the video now and attempt the questions. Done? What did you come up with? Well, cannon were, especially early cannon, were unsuitable in battles because they didn't have a carriage that allowed them to be manoeuvred easily and quickly and transported between battles. They were also incredibly time consuming to load, and so the gunners would have been vulnerable to being charged down by enemies. So what changes could be made? Well, actually the guns could be made somewhat smaller by the Mons Meg. This made them easier to transport and easier to load. Larger wheels could also be used. Notice the 4 wheels on Mons Meg's carriage. This doesn't allow it to be elevated very easily, so it can't be aimed very easily. You also can't twist it very easily either. By fitting 2 larger wheels, then you'd be able to manoeuvre the gun much more easily. But there's probably one biggest thing that could be changed. Sometime after Mons Meg was retired from action, it was fired in a ceremony, which went wrong. Mons Meg exploded. Notice the damage here. One of the strengthening rings has shattered and you can see the bands of the original gun barrel underneath. As far as I remember, although I might want to check this, a man was killed when this happened, and that wasn't unusual for early gun barrels. Part of the development of the gun is the development of metal technology. Better, stronger metals also made for better, safer and more reliable guns. Or at least they were safer for the operators, not for the people they were pointed at. And so, this very noisy development is going to revolutionise the state of warfare, and it continues to have an impact to this day. That's the end. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I hope it was useful. If it was, please like the video, consider subscribing to my channel, and there'll be more content like this coming soon. Thanks very much, and goodbye.